Hi everyone, I'm Joe. Today it's time for me to do a book review of Monstrous Regiment, written by Terry Pratchett. This is a fantasy novel first published in 2003, and this is the 31st Discord novel. So, first of all, what is the Discord? It is, as the name blatantly suggests, a disc-shaped world which by itself rests on the back of 4 very large elephants, which happen to stand on the back of a very large world turtle called Gratitude, which swims through space as though it was water. It sounds strange, and it is, but the concept of this works extremely well, and this is the 31st novel, so by this point, hopefully you will have read at least one other Discord novel, ideally a few, and the concept of this will not be new to you, and it will work out in a much better way because this is a more developed Discworld than the earlier novels, and it will greatly benefit from at least a couple of earlier books, personally. So, as far as the synopsis or the plot goes of this book, it starts off focusing on the character of Polly Perks. She is a young woman who, in the very first paragraph, is making the rather hard choice to cut her hair extremely short, to wear trousers, and to fart very loudly. Now this is not just because she wants to basically annoy her parents or be a rude member of society. It's actually because she wants to join the army of her country. Her country is called Borogravia, and her brother, sometime previously, also joined the army, and he disappeared. Nobody knows exactly where he went, although somebody must do, but she certainly doesn't. And basically she's trying to go essentially undercover, pretending to be a young man in the army to find out where he went, and ideally, if he's still alive, try to sort of get him back to her and her family. So she volunteers herself for the army, which is quite rare, into a unit led by a Sergeant Jack Rum, who is this sort of quite big man. He's loud and very sort of everything that she's trying to be, farting loudly and shouting loudly and that sort of thing. That's what Sergeant Jack Rum is. He's a very interesting individual, and one that, let's just say, is a very powerful character indeed, just as powerful as Polly, or indeed the rest of the characters. So, once she joins this military unit, off they go on military exercises, and indeed to join the war, because in Bulgaria there is always a war. Frankly, it's a small country, but due to certain individuals, basically everybody's been manipulated into essentially fighting wars because it profits certain people, as is sadly the case in the real world. And at this point, though, they haven't got much of a military left because they're continuously fighting war, but they do have a bit of one, not much. And let's just say Polly's unit, with just Sergeant Jack Rum, they go off, start getting involved, and they get involved in something that is considerably bigger than them. Specifically, all the neighbouring countries are starting to get a bit fed up with this country of Borogravia because they just keep being aggressive, but there's no real threat there because, frankly, they're sort of grinding themselves into the dirt. So they just want Bulgaria to basically be, a more modern country and, actually calm down, but they're not really doing so. So there's a lot of political tensions and, things behind the scenes running, which Polly is not aware of, although obviously she becomes aware of them. I mean, she's the main character, of course she's got to become aware of these things eventually. And things start spiraling outwards in a rather dramatic fashion, and she gets involved in things that she never thought she would, or indeed never thought would even be possible for her as, this sort of small country person, completely unknown, and, she becomes a notable figure, unsurprisingly, being the main character. So, and the reason that she becomes the main character is because of the other character, which is where I'm going to, the subject that I'm going to talk about now. Because the characters in this book are all really varied and interesting. Polly, of course, is a young woman pretending to be a young man, although she's obviously trying to pretend to be a certain type of young man, this sort of, military type guy who's, very rude and not very well brought up. That's what she's pretending to be. That's her role. And indeed, that is what she is also working with in the military unit, because some of the other characters are also very much like that, whether that is real or not, or whether they are just actually, they might be more polite in real life and they're also, trying to fit in, because frankly this novel is about fitting in. Then that may be the case. Sergeant Jack Rom, who is the the leader of the unit, he's a very interesting character. As I've said, he has an interesting psychology and interesting motivation for doing things. Obviously, all the people in his unit are, his lads, his boys, and he really does value them. I mean, he will be the one to shout at them. He doesn't want anybody else shouting at them, because that's literally his job. And there's also some other interesting members of his unit, like for instance one called Maledicta, who is a vampire. So you've got a vampire soldier. Vampires don't normally get involved in things, so that's interesting by itself. And the overall collection of characters is a varied one, and you've got such a variation of psychologies and motivations for doing things. It's really interesting. And you do have some older returning characters in this, like for instance Captain Samuel Vimes from the City Watch novels makes an appearance, because obviously Warpwalk is getting involved, because it's one of the biggest cities around, and they are trying to sort of calm this country down. So Vimes is there. Characters from the paper, the Warpwalk Times, William de Word from the novel The Times, he is also in this novel along with a few other characters, and it's a very interesting combination of characters and motivations for doing things, and what makes this novel work extremely well. And another thing that makes this novel work well is the location, the setting. Now, as always, the world building for Terry Pratchett is really important. He creates in this an interesting environment, because this is Belgravia. This is basically a small, mid sort of European positioned country, essentially, that is very aggressive, attacks its neighbours most of the time, and basically tries to hit above its weight, but doesn't do a very good job of it. And everybody getting annoyed, and hence why things starting to spiral outwards in a rather chaotic fashion. This Belgravia country is an interesting one, because it's not one that we've ever had mentioned before. Indeed, before this book, obviously it didn't exist. It was just a part of this greater overall land of small European countries, that sort of thing, because Terry Pratchett already established that kind of environment in the world. And it's an interesting country with interesting inhabitants, and the politics of it is really interesting, and one that really ties into the themes and ideas of the novel, which I'll talk about now, because one of them is obviously about somebody trying to fit in, obviously, because Polly is a young woman trying to be a young man, as I've said, and she's desperately trying to fit in so she can achieve her aims, but the world doesn't entirely want to accept her as that, but she's trying as desperately as she can. And there are other characters that are obviously trying to desperately fit in to this world and don't know how to go about it exactly, other than pretend to be this rather sort of rude and crude young man joining the army. That's what several of the characters are acting the role of, because even if they're not, they might be like really polite and things, they've got to act that to find a place for themselves, at least for now, which is interesting and shows a lot about obviously the characters. And indeed, that's what happens in the real life and in the real world. People are always trying to find their place, and they don't know how. And if society, is very judgmental, and frankly, racism, sexism. I mean, sexism is blatantly a thing in this book. Comes into place. religious differences. People don't want to. Basically, intolerance. It's a book about intolerance and about characters who are trying to break through that barrier of intolerance and become something more than what the society wants to allow them to be. And it's a really interesting theme and one that I really enjoyed. Obviously, as I've just mentioned, it is also a novel about equality between, gender, and in a way it mentions a few other things I don't want to talk about, but let's just say this is a female character pretending to be a male character, and you could actually take it as transgender in some senses, and indeed there are other characters that you could almost think that they're pretending to be things they're not. They're pretending to be loud and crude when they're not loud and crude. And I'm not going to go into detail on this because there are interesting things that I think would benefit you from reading yourself rather than me talking about them, which would involve spoilers. But suffice to say, it talks about it in an interesting way. I'm not entirely sure 100% if Pratchett meant it in such a way. We just sort of developed that way in the novel, and he just happily went along with it. But it's certainly an interesting way overall. And finally, the last major point of the novel that I'm going to talk about is the fact that this is blatantly an anti-war novel. This is saying about the pointlessness of war, that it doesn't benefit anybody generally apart from a few people behind the scenes that are basically, sort of causing all the trouble, and they obviously basically are making money through, arms, through, selling off resources that people lack due to the fact that war's going on and resources are scarce, which happens sadly enough in real life and oddly and scarily appropriate in the world right now. And it's saying some very interesting points which are very important to read. So overall, in summary, this is a really well written book with interesting characters, an interesting environment and world, and of course interesting larger messages. Pratchett's humour comes through all the time, as it always does, whilst making extremely important and very personal points about things that go on in the real world. And I would highly recommend reading this, although I would highly recommend reading a few other Discworld novels first, just so you have an idea of where the Discworld is at this point, because this is a far more developed Discworld than the early novels, and I personally would think that it would benefit from having at least just one or two of the early novels, so you can see the development of the world and development of the society of the world first, personally. So I will put a link of this book in the description box below. If you've read this book and you'd like to talk about it, then please leave a comment, or you want to ask any questions or anything else that I can maybe answer, I can't guarantee, then please leave a comment and we can talk about it. All my social media links can be found in the description box below. And with that said, that is it for this video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you another day. Bye for now.